And for those of you who maybe have just joined us or are unaware, you find us now in the middle of the series, which I am leading in response to this remarkable book called The Five Invitations by Frank Ostaseski. And we are going to, in a moment, explore the third invitation, which, as the title of today's sermon probably more than amply explains, is to bring our whole selves into any experience. And I will unpack that and do justice as I can to a beautiful part of the book. It's always very hard in this brief time to be ever able to do justice to someone's work and someone's deep thinking. I'm sure this book was many, many years in the making, but at least to touch upon some of the salient points and share them with you. Hugging the cactus. Frank begins this chapter and he said, imagine if you had a large cut-out version of yourself and you cut it up like a jigsaw puzzle. And then in the reassembling of the jigsaw puzzle, I probably, like any of us would do, you would look at it and think, actually, if I could just maybe reassemble it, maybe I would leave this little piece out and maybe I wouldn't include that. And I don't like actually the shape of my nose, so maybe I might not include this. And the list can go on and on and on. And I'm sure that you would understand and resonate with that same sentiment. And we don't just do that in making a large jigsaw of ourselves. We all can at times fall prey to cutting out parts of ourselves, whether that's in denial, whether that's distancing ourselves from certain elements of our personality, our thinking, our way of being that we don't like. Very often, as you know, people that we hold up and we put on a pedestal, we find out that they were leading double lives. Why? Because of this whole distancing and inability to hug the cactus of their lives. Very often, not being able to leads to shame, and shame, as we know, is a debilitating part of the human experience. Frank says, it is the wisdom gained from our suffering, our vulnerability, and our healing that enables us to be of real assistance to others. He calls it an empathetic bridge. And I was reminded as I was reading this chapter of when I took a gap year between finishing my high school and going to college. And as most people who take a gap year, I decided I wanted to travel Europe, and I bought myself a Eurail pass. And in Europe, you can pay a certain amount and you buy an unlimited ticket, which means that you can travel to any country in Europe by train, unlimited so. And very often I would sleep on the train, eat on the train, party on the train, meet people on the train, do everything that I needed on the train because it was a cheap way of traveling. And one day my friend and I met this young man between Paris and Bordeaux, which is in the southwest of France. And I would be, I don't know, a little over 18. And he was carrying his hashish, I think it was, in a little jar, but it wasn't the hashish that caught my attention. It was what was on the lid. And it was my very, very first exposure, if you can believe, at the age of 18, to the yin and the yang symbol. And I think there obviously in that first appreciation of it, the two things that struck me were, first of all, as we know, it's a circle completely divided in half, and there the light and dark sit on the inside of that circle, nestled into one another. So the part was the thing that struck me. The second thing, of course, is that little round circle inside each part. Inside the light is a round circle of dark, and inside the dark is a round circle of light. And I think that if you were to ask me, where in my life did I begin my spiritual journey that put me where I am today, I would probably say on that train ride with that young, very handsome, very lovely French man with his hashish case, and an introduction to that philosophical understanding that yes, we are light, but we are also dark. And in the dark is light, and in the light is dark. And I think that when Frank says that we have to build that empathetic bridge between one another and draw on our vulnerabilities, it's drawing on, as he said, our helplessness, which I think is almost counterintuitive to how we're raised in a way. We're raised to be strong and independent and able. And he said that sometimes our strength comes in our helplessness. He also talks about roles. And of course, we are multiple roles. When I run the youth program and we do our getting to know you, I get them to take a piece of paper and they trace out their hand like this. And then I say, okay, take your hand away. And inside the fingers, I want you to write, who are you? But I don't want you to write the obvious things. I want you to write the unobvious things, the parts of you that go beyond roles and immediate identity. And it's always astounding to me what they write inside their hands when they're given the chance to do so. And I always remember my friend's daughter, Lucy, who I was very close to. And at the age of 3, she would walk around and she would say, hello, my name is Lucy and I'm an artist. And I thought, how beautiful that at the age of 3, you can already go outside of your role than just being daughter or sister or granddaughter or friend. Roles, as we know, often serve us in the first part of our lives. Yes, we are parents or not. We define ourselves, as you know, we'll go anywhere and people ask us, what do you do? And Frank, of course, is drawing us to the knowledge that those roles have their place in our lives. And in it, we can develop skills that do serve us at the time. But as we grow older, very often they become insufficient and sometimes even inappropriate to support the next stages of our life, which I would argue probably we're all at the moment, and hence our desire and our drive to draw alongside one another week in and week out. In that next stage, he said, is an inward one, where we begin exploring the meaning of life and embracing mystery, cultivating wisdom, and relaxing certain strivings that were appropriate once, but now are no more. Roles, of course, as we know, are very fluid, and if we over-identify with them, they tend to confine us and restrict us and reduce us. And I love the words of Ram Dass. He says, don't be a role, be a soul. Roles, of course, narrow our vision of each other, not just of ourselves. And very often when we meet people and we ask them that question, what do you do? We're immediately narrowing them and we're not seeing them as full people. And we tend to project then our story onto them. I remember a great teacher of mine, one of my first teachers actually in seminary, Rabbi, always used to say, there came a point when he would get into the back of a taxi and he would stop telling people he was a rabbi because he was tired of having to explain all the problems of the world. He just decided, I'm no longer going to do that. I'm going to share another aspect of my life. And that was a powerful teaching for him as well. And very often roles and identities also tend to sort of separate ourselves, especially from the suffering around us, the suffering of others. In my contemplation this month, in Black History Month, I decided I wanted to go back and revisit the teachings of James Baldwin, because he has been a great teacher to me and an inspiration. And coincidentally, just a few days before we gathered here today, I heard this remarkable recording and I thought, oh, how appropriate. And I wanted to share it with you. He said, love has never been a popular movement because, of course, we can despair. Walk down the street of any city on any afternoon, and what you've got to remember is that those that you are looking at are also you. Profound. In other words, it blends in with what Frank is teaching us, to not run from our pain, especially when we see it or experience it in others, or even try to fix it. Another great teacher of mine, I'm sure her name is very familiar to you, Pema Chodron, beautiful American Buddhist teacher. She says that in these moments when we begin to feel uncomfortable, either with what's going on in another person or what's going on inside us, hold your seat, she says. Don't squirm, don't run, don't try to fix, don't try to change, just stay put, hold your seat. Frank shared a beautiful teaching from Rachel Naomi Remen, and I know I spoke about her last time, and I want to share it with you, if I may. Helping, fixing, and serving represent three different ways of seeing life. And this is so interesting that someone who's devoted her life to these three things writes this, but bear with me. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. When you serve, you see life as whole. Fixing and helping may be the work of the ego, but service is the work of the soul. Frank asks us, do we have the courage? And here we are in that new year that I spoke of earlier. It's a new year when courage is being offered to us, and embrace it. Can we embrace that courage to sit with our fears or our shadows? And he says, listen to what secrets they may have and what secrets they want to give up. Perhaps the part of the chapter that hit me personally the most, and so I want to spend a couple of moments sharing it with you, because I think maybe some of you might identify with it also. He talks about the self-critic. I have to tell you that I wouldn't say a driven person, but I am somebody who likes to do and be and offer my best. But the very thing that I do very often is the moment, whatever it is that I've done, I then start to self-question myself, second guess myself, criticize myself. I could have done this. I should have done that. I shouldn't have said that. I could have done that better. And it reminded me of that powerful testimonial that Brené Brown shares, where, if you remember, what made her famous and what went viral was the TED talk she gave on vulnerability. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. But she says that when she finished her talk, she drove home and all she did was berate herself and say, oh my goodness, Brené, you shouldn't have said this. You shouldn't have said that. Why did you say this? You were terrible. You were awful. No one's going to listen. But of course, as we know, and as history proved otherwise, it became one of the TED Talks most downloaded talks in its entire history. And it launched her into the teaching and writing world in a way that she'd never experienced before. And I also love that story that Oprah tells, that in her years as inviting people on her talk show, on her Super Soul Sunday, she said it didn't matter who she had on, whether it was a president, a rock star, a movie star, a great author, an artist. At the end of every single session, when the cameras had stopped rolling, the people who were invited onto her show would turn and look at her and say, "Oprah, how was it?" And I took a measure of comfort from that, knowing that I wasn't the only one in which was afflicted that self-critic and that self-judge. So in essence, what all of this goes to show, and what this chapter is encouraging us, is that when we bring our whole self, including that critic, including that vulnerability, including that brokenness, all those parts that feel inadequate, we bring our whole self forward. And he encourages us to actually make room in our lives for our blemishes, our lack, our errors. The founder of the seminary that Sonia and I both went to is an amazing man. He died in 2010. His name was Rabbi Joseph Gelberman. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he decided that when he came to America, he was going to dedicate his life to moving in the opposite spirit of what he and his family had experienced. He lost, I think, 17 members of his family, if I remember correctly. And his great teaching was succinct, but it was powerful. He said this: never instead of, always in addition to. Never instead of, always in addition to. In other words, embracing everything and the whole. I love what Frank said, the difference between judgment and non-judgment. Judgment, he said, is harsh and aggressive, and it shuts things down. But discernment, the antidote to judgment, discernment makes space and helps wisdom emerge. And I think it also helps us to get beyond ourselves. Let me share a very brief story with you, something that really did happen to me, in which I laid down the judgment and I opened myself to discernment in a way that perhaps I hadn't ever done before. In 2015, when I was living and working in Australia, my whole life imploded. And I decided that the best thing for me to do was to run away and to run back to the States. And I was rather hoping that in doing so, I would be able to build a new life for myself, go back to my roots, forget everything that had gone wrong, all the losses, all the pain, all the injuries. And it felt wisdom to me at the time. And of course, the people that I'd left in the United States and my friends and family were all very, very embracing of this idea. Yes, come back to the States. Wonderful. Let's make it happen. I had people trying to find me jobs and homes and cars and you name it. And I was going along with it until one day I went with little Lucy that I told you about, the artist, the 3-year-old artist. And I decided to take her to the Museum of Photography. And she's doing what any great artist lover at the age of 3 would do. And she was running excitedly in and out of all the rooms, gasping and coming back to tell me her thoughts and her impressions of everything. And I found myself just ducking very quickly into a tiny little room And it said that there were some National Geographic photos. Now, I love National Geographic. I decided to go in. And to my amazement, it actually ended up being photographs taken of an amazing true story that became a book and then later a movie. If you know either, I would urge you to read it. It's called Tracks, about the woman, a young woman who single-handedly walks across the western part of Australia, remote, barren, harsh, unforgiving desert with just 3 camels. And there were photographs of this. And as I sat with Lucy running around excitedly, I looked, and in this moment, the judgment that I had laid against everything that had gone on for me in Australia disappeared in a nanosecond, in a flash, and suddenly there was discernment. And this knowing, this understanding that I had to go back. I had to go back and lay to rest all the things that I had run away from and to tie up my loose ends. In fact, that journey would end up taking another 4 years while I was there. I thought I would go back just for 4 weeks. That will teach me. But I share this story because I feel it's a wonderful, very real example of how discernment is different to judgment. It's counterintuitive very often. And in that case, and in all these cases, I had to trust it. I want to close the reflection with something that Frank shared about anger and hatred, these dark things that very often we try to avoid or we are ashamed of, especially those of us who are on a spiritual journey. We feel, oh, I can't, I'm a spiritual person. I can't possibly have anger or hatred. He had been very wronged by someone who'd falsely accused him of something. And he took this anger, and rather than show it, he just felt it secretly, inwardly. And then one day he was visiting a Zen monastery. And at the entrance of it was the archetypal form of the Buddha called Manjushri, that's Zen Buddhism, who is a form of the Buddha who wields a sword in his right hand. And that sword is called discriminating wisdom. And he stopped suddenly in his tracks and realized, goodness, the outer projection that he was suffering with, anger towards his accuser, was actually turned in on himself. As Pema Chodron said, to quote her again, the problem is that in our desire to change or avoid or deny, it's fundamentally a form of aggression towards ourselves. So a spiritual practice is not about bypassing or transcending, but actually encouraging us to sit in the simplicity of being exactly who and fully who we are. Mindfulness, says Frank, is a deconditioning. How about that? Mindfulness is deconditioning. It's a merciful, awake presence of mind that no longer blocks the heart. Next time, he says, when you're feeling these emotions, all these memories, all these blocks, all these problems, look up, he says, and remember that you're as amazing as the blue sky, and your emotions are just those passing clouds. Compassion, which really is the essence of this whole teaching, is what allows us to draw close to that yin and that yang. And when we get close As Rabbi Gelberman said, there is no instead of, it's a both and. And the illusion of I and other and separation and not belonging and judgment and criticism melt away. So may compassion be ours, and may we bring our whole selves, the shadow and the light, and do as Pema Chodron said, to sit on our mat, hold our seat, and learn day by day, step by step, how to be at peace with all parts of who we are, thereby being able to serve not only ourselves, but others. Thank you all.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.